Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have Talia Welsh once again on the podcast. Talia is someone that was on the podcast earlier, and her previous episode actually has some of the most downloads and most listens, which is fantastic. In that episode, we talked a lot about the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty. And so I've been wanting to get her back on the podcast and talk about so many other things we didn't get to. And that's what we do in this episode. As a reminder, Talia is a UC Foundation professor of philosophy and women and gender sexuality studies at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. She studies Merleau-Ponty and has translated some of his lectures in child psychology and has written on him and many other philosophers as well. In this episode, we devoted a lot of time to feminist theory and mostly in how she understands it, what her work is in that world and how it expands outward. And she really takes an existentialist approach, a phenomenological approach to feminism. We started the conversation by talking about this idea of does feminism offer and contribute to the field of philosophy, or does it completely revolutionize it? And sort of a rhetorical question. We don't find the answer at the end of it, but we definitely talk about that a lot. We talk about what do we do with problematic artists, and can we divorce art from the artist? We talk about how feminism can help to understand one's constitution and how they develop over time. We talk about what it means to be a woman. How do we understand masculinity and femininity? How do we reform masculinity? We talk about reimagining the nuclear family in the 21st century. And then we start moving on into some other areas. The feminist angle is always kind of in the background, but we talk about how do we live a life worth living, in a kind of active, participatory way of living life. We talk about the ambiguity of deciding the value of someone's contribution to society. We talk about do we have room for redemption and forgiveness in society. We talk towards the end about work and its variance. We talk about differences between cognition and thinking. We talk about how work can provide meaning, but how we could also find meaning in other things. We talk a little bit about science, religion, some of the critiques, and many other topics. This was such a wonderful conversation. It's a long one, and I was hoping it would be. It's about 3 hours. And, after the first conversation with Talia, we just got on well together immediately. And, when we decided to do another one, I said, okay, one condition, you have to be on here much longer than an hour. And she said, absolutely. And, we got up to 3 hours, and it was absolutely fantastic. I greatly enjoy talking with her and fleshing out these ideas and pushing and pulling on them and figuring them out and or not, and having more questions than answers sometimes. And so she was just absolutely wonderful. And I'm excited for you all to hear the conversation. So now I bring you Talia Welsh. I am here with Talia Welsh. Again, thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Thank you.
I was telling you before we hit record that our previous conversation is one of the most downloaded. People really love you and they love what you have to say. So
Great.
I'm really, really fortunate to have you back on here again. So thank you.
Super happy to hear that.
Yeah. So last time we left off, we had, kind of, at least for me and maybe for listeners, given some type of an appetizer. So hopefully we can get to the main course here. So there was a few things that we wanted to kind of get at. So I guess, and a little bit more, I guess, on some of your more current ideas of things that you're working on and teaching and writing about and et cetera. So I think one topics we can start with here is on, you've taught and written on feminist theory and feminism. And so maybe give us a kind of overview of how you understand that and how you work around and in that kind of field and your kind of mark in that world.
Great, thanks. So I should say that feminism is, of course, feminist philosophy is a big topic. You know, there's philosophers who do all sorts of approaches in this field, and I situate myself in the post Simone de Beauvoir continental theory. So I don't want to speak authoritatively for all feminist philosophy.
Sure.
So I think there's two. When I teach in women's studies, what we call now women and gender studies. Actually, my field right now in my department is called women, gender, and sexuality studies. So it's kind of a broad topic. And I tend to start the classes by talking about there's courses that we're looking at rehabilitating and learning about female figures in the past that have been passed over. So that's one part of what we might call feminist philosophy. So just there's feminist philosophers that have been marginalized for various reasons. And we want to bring them to the history of ideas and make them present. But there also, I think, in a deeper sense, feminist philosophy is about asking if philosophy in general has had some, so definitely philosophy in general, I don't think any contemporary philosopher would say that philosophy has been male biased. So that would be a topic I think most even male philosophers would say, fine, yes, that's true. But does philosophy in general need to reconsider its fundamental premises because of the rise of feminist thinking? So this to me is a really interesting question. So do we need to just add on women's experience to philosophy, like that philosophy has largely been about male experience, and so we want to make an addition to say here's female experience? Or do we want to say that female experience is so important that it revolutionizes philosophy altogether? I should say, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a question, right?
Right.
But I mean, I think that's to me the fundamental kind of question in the way I approach feminist philosophy is that are we looking at adding on to a tradition and supplementing it and deepening it and making it more profound in this certain way? Or are we looking to revolutionize that tradition in the way that you might think a Marxist would say that I'm not looking to add on to capitalism, I'm looking to obliterate capitalism and provide a new ground for it. And so I think that's a really, to me, the way the kind of tradition that I've been brought up in feminist thought, that's the question. Like, what are we doing in feminist thought? Are we adding on to a pre-existing, long-lasting, fabulous tradition that we've all been educated in? So certainly from somebody in my age, I was educated by only men. Almost all the philosophers that I write about are men. So to me, the adding on tradition makes a lot of sense, but the revolutionizing tradition is also kind of compelling because it would be to undermine a certain way of thinking. What do we create new? That's the question.
I guess it's a good question. I think. Yeah. I think. I read. I'm sure you've had to have heard of it at this point. There was two women. They compiled a bunch of female philosophers, and they put the book out, the Philosopher Queens. Have you heard of this book? Yeah, lovely book.
I haven't read it, but yeah, I've heard. Yeah,
it's lovely. It's each chapter gives I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 pages. They're kind of like essays that they've collected from different people and they compile together. It's got really nice illustrations. It's pretty much for the layperson. And, basically stating just what you're saying, like philosophy has a long tradition of overwhelmingly, 95% males. And that's not to say that women don't have good ideas. Of course they do,
Right.
or that there haven't been women that tried to express their ideas and weren't able to for various reasons. And so trying to kind of elevate them, and that was kind of their point of being like, at the very least, just giving exposure. I remember I read this book with my daughter, and we would read kind of like a chapter, a night, and it would just be like a new philosopher every night, which was really cool. And we would talk about it, and I'd ask her, I'm like, who do you like? Why do you like this one? And she's like, I don't like their ideas. Their ideas are weird, or I kind of get some of that one, or I really like this one. And it was cool. It was cool to kind of talk about the ideas. And it was cool. I think it's 20 philosophers, 20 women. And so I probably agree, kind of similar to you on the first point. I think, well, I would say it in 2 parts. The first part would be, yes, we probably should go back throughout time and say, let's give some of these women credit for their ideas that deserve credit. That's beyond fair. I mean, I think that's totally appropriate. And as we move forward, we should have generating ideas, philosophical ideas or social ideas from, men and women, right? I mean, I think we should have both that, and they should be able to get their credit and their due. The second one, the kind of revolutionizing piece, I'm not so sure. I guess I would be curious about the arguments for it, because for me, sometimes, and I could have this wrong, but sometimes this will have this kind of revisionist history where, well, these guys had good ideas, but all these ad hominem attacks, they were anti-Semitic, they were racist, they were bigots, they were misogynist, they were problematic, which fair enough. There's a handful of them that had a lot of issues. But at the end of the day, I guess I would go back to, I'm not a trained philosopher, properly, but my understanding of philosophy is, how do we understand ideas and how do we exchange ideas? And having a wide pool of that should be important. And how do we have people from our past, male or female, that have, how do we build on that? When I think about the tradition of philosophy, I think this happens in theology. I think this happens in psychology. Everything is kind of like a hyperlink, right? You read Kant, and then you read Hegel, and then you read Husserl, and then you read Nietzsche, and you read Heidegger, and you read, like, it's just, then you get to Gadamer. They're all building off of each other. And they'll quote each other all the time, and they'll say, like, well, this is why half their ideas are horrible, and this is why I'm going to build on it better. And like, you just kind of see that in general with philosophy. And so my thing would be, well, let's take the ideas of Merleau-Ponty, let's take the ideas of Heidegger, let's take the ideas of Sartre, and say, well, how do we keep using those ideas with new problems we have in the 21st century? And we have men and women that are doing that. So I wonder what would be the utility of the kind of latter argument of this.
The kind of revolutionary. I mean, that's a great question. Something that I think about a lot, and when I've raised this, and I teach only undergraduates, so we would raise this in a class, not in a very, I should say, theoretical, sophisticated way. So one way that we could raise this in a class would be to talk about the protection of works from very questionable men. So
you give an example,
or someone like that, and
like whom?
Like Woody Allen or someone, so students have very strong thoughts about this. So they're questioning about. So the latter argument to me would be that the fact that one aspect of it should be, I don't want to say the latter argument entirely. So the idea that we need to fundamentally rethink how we do philosophy, or how we do thinking, I should say, how we do thinking, how we think about things. Would be that if we think about the protection of cultural objects that we're very familiar with, like films or books or so forth. Mm-hmm. And so a very contemporary problem that's, I think anyone who would listen to this podcast would be aware of. You find out your favorite author was this super horrible dude who, I don't know, was a pederast or was women or whatever, you know. Right. So what do you do with that? You know, what do you do with that thought? One thought traditionally, I think, and the tradition I was brought up in, would be that it doesn't matter because Heidegger would say he doesn't care about Aristotle. He lived, he did philosophy, he died. He doesn't, like, his biography is not important. The important thing is the philosophy. In the case of literature or film, it'd be the film or the literature. But I do think that feminist thought has largely kind of wondered about if that's the case, like, should we not investigate that a little bit more deeply? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting when I teach undergraduates in a state university in Tennessee. So, you know, these are not the most sophisticated of undergraduates. They're smart undergraduates, but not, you know, haven't seen the world a lot. They find this question really, really interesting. They really want to think a lot about whether or not it matters what the kind of person who produced this work was. Mm-hmm. And I find that question really interesting too. So, I mean, as a philosopher, as a deeper level or on a larger level, like you're raising, like, are there eternal questions or larger questions that exceed our personal contingent historical situations? Like, what is right or what is wrong, or what is the good life? Or are those questions always cultural in some deep sense? I have to say, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think something like Woody Allen movies to me are really interesting because they really were influential to me as a person. I loved his movies. I still love his movies, most of them.
Yeah, this is...
Yeah, like the fact it's like often about an older dude and a younger woman, and then hearing this weird stuff about his family is...
Sure.
It's somehow present, but I'm not sure what to do with it. And the same thing with Plato, when Plato talks about, you know, mm-hmm. I don't know, like, I don't know what you do with that kind of information. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll say I had I actually really enjoy this debate, so I'm kind of glad you brought it up. Before the pandemic, I did this. I haven't talked about it too much on the podcast. I think I've maybe made some tweets and some people I know, but I used to do, as a friend of mine, we started a salon, like kind of the old school people get together. Okay. It's kind of like awesome. A dinner party thing, but it's this exchange of, you know, intellectual or whatever ideas of society. And I remember one of the first ones we did, we had a group of people and we do it probably once a month. And it was really cool. It was really, really cool. The pandemic kind of, like most things, put it to a halt, and, you know, we tried doing it virtually for a little bit, and it was a little tough, but, and one of the first, we did probably, I don't know, 15 of them, I guess, over a year and a half. And one of the first ones we did was this issue, which is, can you separate the artist from the art? Right. And you can, you know, supplement art for, you know, either in film or writing or fine art, etc., music.
Yeah.
And people are pretty there's not a lot of people that are kind of like, yeah, I'm in the middle on this. People are typically on one side of this.
Well, I say I am one of the rare people who's in the middle, but yes,
Are you okay? Okay.
people feel very
They
passionately
feel
about
very
this.
passionate. I would
They're
say
passionate.
I'm more on one side, but I can be in the middle because I can hold the other side. I get it. I really do
Yeah.
get it. But yeah, so it's this question of, what do you do? I had a conversation with David Howinski. He's a philosopher at the University of West Virginia. He's lovely, lovely guy. He's really smart. He owns like 1,000 or over thousands of books in his libraries. He's well read. He's awesome.
Yeah.
And we had this conversation, and I think his dissertation, I know he's written academically on this, is this kind of looking at the biographical aspects of philosophers as it comes through their philosophy.
Yeah.
Which was interesting because we kind of started the conversation about that. And then as we got in the conversation, we started talking about Heidegger. And he loves Heidegger. And I love Heidegger in terms of his philosophy and his ideas.
Right.
I mean, Being in Time is
he's a
wonderful.
Biographical nightmare. Right?
Oh, he's so absolute nightmare.
Such a nightmare.
He's an absolute nightmare. He's always like, a thorn in my side in terms of his, biographical complications. And we talked about that. And we obviously both don't like his personal life and his biography and more so his kind of refusal to publicly dismiss after the fact, which was that's more problematic for me than like, all right, I can kind of get it in the beginning before all the like horrible stuff, but come on, buddy, like after the fact. And, he lived until 74, 76, never really officially kind of condemned it, and that is really hard to sit in my head. It's really hard to sit in my head. So we get it.
Rand talks about that. And she famously had this affair with Heidegger.
Yeah.
And had a long-term friendship with him after that.
Mm-hmm.
And refused to announce herself as a feminist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Super frankly. And actually Simone de Beauvoir is similar in that.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know enough to say for sure. One never knows one's personality, but I think it was a concern about that if you define somebody by these labels, and this is an existentialist point of view that I personally ascribe to a lot, is that identifying individuals and identifying oneself is inauthentic. Like, we can always become a different thing.
Yeah.
So to say this is a racist or this is a homophobe. I also think Hannah Arendt just sincerely enjoyed and got an interesting relationship with Heidegger intellectually.
Absolutely.
And so her notion of the affair was just like, well, we were together, but now we have this intellectual engagement. It's difficult to understand given her work on Eichmann and Jerusalem and did she not understand what Heidegger's positions were? I mean, again, I don't know that story, but I can see that if you didn't think about the World War II perspective, just aesthetically, like, you could still appreciate somebody's philosophy without affirming them as a human being, broadly speaking.
Yeah. Well,
and you could say that their ideas retained a value independent of them as failed, flawed human beings. And that's this question that I think is really interesting phenomenologically, because as a phenomenologist, that I do feel like our ideas are tied to our lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say I propose an ideology that's abhorrent, it's not independent of me as a lived human being situation. But I'm hesitant, I think, as you were talking about, to reduce it down to that and just say, well, that's just because you're this person from this situation. So, I mean, that's an issue that I think is really fundamental to feminist philosophy, is that if the personal is the political, how do we deal with historically, now in retrospect, problematic views, and how important is it who the person is that alters that thing? So I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, this is also the problem because I mean, I totally hear that. I've heard that argument, and I can really sit with it. I think it's interesting because I think it's interesting on 2 points. So the first point is when somebody has an idea, okay, I can talk about this with you because you do philosophy. Is it really your idea? Do you own it? Right? If thoughts rise to consciousness, we don't know where they come from within being. And they rise to consciousness. We didn't decide to have those thoughts, and we didn't decide necessarily to have those ideas. They can be influenced by, of course, our experiences, our relationships, our environment, our histories, etc. Absolutely. But in the moment of we have the idea and we didn't 2 seconds ago, and it comes to us. Is it ours? Well, it's only ours, and you're only the author of it, right? Because this kind of gets into the free will argument.
right.
But it's only ours in so much as that it comes from our mind or it comes from our consciousness. But we'll put the free will argument on the shelf for a minute. If we're not necessarily the pure author of those ideas, they just come to us in consciousness and then we put it out.
Yeah.
Then the idea is the idea, right? Obviously, you could say, well, if it didn't come from your mind, then we wouldn't have had it out in the world. Fair enough. Potentially. I mean, maybe you would have had it from someone else or in a different way, but let's just say from the 1-to-1 ratio here. Okay, fine. That didn't happen. You have the idea. I think you can do it in 2 ways. If you take the ideas and you try to look at them objectively or neutrally and say, this idea is awesome. This idea makes sense. We should do some of these things. And then you find out that the person that had the idea killed someone or they did something. That doesn't mean necessarily, because what you're doing is you're basically distilling a person down to one attribute or one trait. And humans are absolutely complicated. We have so many variables, so many things going on. We're really, really messy. And so I'll give you an example. When I've worked at various inpatient hospitals, and when I've worked in various inpatient hospitals, you'll have some folks in there that have done some pretty terrible things. Right? People that have actually murdered people, they've raped people, they've done some horrible things. Okay. Horrible. And they have also mental illness. Okay. They're being rehabilitated, right? They're getting treatment. Sometimes some of those human beings, they're not less of a human because they because they commit horrendous acts against another human. They're still human. They would create the most beautiful pieces of art.
Yeah.
They would write poetry that was incredible. They would write short stories that were so amazing of capturing the human spirit. And then you go and you read their chart and they're like, wow, this person did that? And it just shows you that, yes, people can create some of the most beautiful pieces of art, some of the best things, some of the things that can actually contribute well to society. And they also could have these horrible impulses and these urges and the worst perversions that we know of the human spirit as well. And I think that is true always. So then the thing would become, well, if you're doing an absolutist all or nothing, why would you, to use the colloquial, throw the baby out with the bathwater? Let's take the good ideas and let's not reward or encourage other negative ones. So back to the Woody Allen example. Annie Hall is a great movie. It's a great film. It's a great film. It's a great film. I will stand by Annie Hall. But I'm standing by the film. I'm standing by all of the things about the story. And Woody Allen is a great screenwriter, and he's a great director. And he's also made some, at the very least, very serious, questionable choices in his personal life.
Right.
At the least.
And one of the questions that's, so the figure that got me into philosophy, which is a super non-traditionally feminist philosopher, is Nietzsche.
He's the best.
So he really embodies this idea that, you want to find the way in which you create this passionate engagement with the world. Mm-hmm. World as it is, not the world as you want it to be, but maybe the world as you want it to be in this sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and in a morally neutral way too, I would say.
100%, yeah.
And I think that that's one of the issues that sort of, so to me as a feminist who has grown up in this Nietzschean philosophy, so I have this experience that I consider sort of funny as a feminist, where in graduate school I remember meeting a fellow philosopher, and she's like, well, one day you'll be a feminist. I was like, yeah, I'm never going to be a feminist. Because I was so married to this idea that ideas were ideas. Mm-hmm. And the value of ideas was external to situations. I mean, so they were like up in the sky in sort of a ephemeral sense. Mm-hmm. And what a good philosopher would do would be to not think about one's own personal situation in interacting with those ideas. If they're good or bad or false or whatever, it's not important. And so I think that, feminism fundamentally requires asking you, which not all people are willing to do, which I understand, to say no to that. That actually the value of ideas actually pushes down the ideas to the situation in which they're occurring. Mm-hmm. I think there's an argument to make in philosophy against that. Mm-hmm. But I just want to say that I think that's the feminist idea, that it's like you have to look at what the situation is now. And so I remember talking about this, but to me, Nietzsche was this like wellspring of ideas. You just want to like create these new theories and rebel against previous ideologies. And but I mean, can you do that in worlds in which, and I think that the news that's been relevant yesterday, George Floyd's Derek Chauvin's conviction, doesn't make sense in worlds in which this kind of thing happens. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that that's somehow connected to the way we develop ideas. We don't develop ideas, we develop ideas as human beings in a certain world. Some of us identify as women, some of us identify as males and some identify as transgender.
Mhm.
But how do we use those ideas to interact with that world? And to
Mhm.
me, that's kind of like a fundamental, I think I want to say feminist question, is that do our identities interact with how we identify with the world in general? And I think I was fundamentally disciplined to understand the world as neutral, qua male, interact with it. But
So I guess I have, I guess one question and I guess one rhetorical question, one actual
yeah,
question. The first one is the rhetorical question is, well, why can't it be both? Right? I don't necessarily think it has to be an either or.
yeah,
Right? Where kind of what now. I recognize that that is very hard for people to hold sort of kind of seemingly opposing ideas at the
no,
same time. But I kind of like what you so nicely put, what Nietzsche said is we have to live in a world that is not, we can shoot and aspire to things we want to
yeah,
do, of course, but to get there is living in the world that is, right? And the world is complicated and humans are complicated. And
right,
I've said this before. I mean, Dostoevsky taught me this. You know, human beings can do the worst possible things to each other and some of the most altruistic, wonderful, cooperative, empathic, compassionate things to each other
yeah,
from the same person, right? It's just kind of
yeah,
uh, one of these things I used to see when in one of my clinical trainings was when I worked with domestic violence, and I worked with perpetrators and victims of
yeah,
domestic violence. The hand can be the tool to give the most pleasure and so much love, and it can also cause the most pain, physically and otherwise. And it's the same body part.
yeah,
And it is how the personal is constructing that, which is important. But the second question I have is why are these things part of feminist thinking? Why are feminists or feminism, is it, I mean, shouldn't, well, let me ask, there's multiple parts to this question.
yeah.
Shouldn't all thoughts think this way? And I would imagine other non-feminists may think this way as well. And what makes that specific to kind of feminist thought of this kind of the personal piece of things, and ideas aren't flat and neutral? And why is that? I guess maybe not endogenous to feminism, but why is it, I guess, somewhat a feature of feminism specifically?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, I don't think I can speak about analytic feminism. So the tradition that comes out of the Anglo-American tradition of what we call analytic philosophy. So I think that the answer is that we want to, if we want to assert that your situation in the world, where you were born, how you were raised, how you think, how you understand your gender versus another person's gender is relevant
Mm-hmm.
to your epistemology, into how you think about the world, then what I would call broadly developmental issues become relevant. So, this philosopher I follow a lot, Merleau-Ponty, says that, development doesn't tell you the outcome of gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many feminist philosophers follow this as well. The development tells you what these, again, it's not to deny the genetic issue. It's not to deny the, biological factors that might determine a person.
Sure.
And so to me, that would be the fundamental kind of feminist concern, is that you want to think about, from the continental perspective, is how does development and constitution, broadly speaking, happen over time?
Mm.
And again, I'm not sure about I don't think that Constitution has to develop along a linear path to be okay. But I do think that one of the features of normalization is that you can be a jock, you can be a arts person, you can be but you have to be along certain paths.
Yeah.
And one of the features I think of kind of the worry about trans identity is that this is not a path we understand.
Mm-hmm.
We understand the sports affiliated child. We understand the academic affiliated child. But the trans child, we don't know, where do you go? Like, what's that path? So I think that that's one of the things that philosophy could come to bear upon the idea of identity and the idea of what it is to be a human being. And I think feminism has really tried to open up that question of and this is from me, Simone de Beauvoir, it's how do you become a woman?
Mm-hmm.
And so what she eloquently, I think, asks is, um, I do have to say sometimes that how do you become a woman seems like you can become any kind of person. She's not actually, what do you call it? Like, she does actually believe in a kind of sex specific identity.
Mm-hmm.
But she thinks how do you identify with that sex specific identity is a becoming, not a endpoint.
Yeah.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's this question, I guess, with right for feminism is it seemed my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that for some periods of feminism, it's well, how do women how do they just get their voice heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then it's
Yeah.
how do they get a seat at the table,
Yeah.
right? And then it's well, how are they at the head of the table, right, so to
Yeah.
speak, using my analogy here. And I think as it branches out, it starts as it is, right, as with any kind of I think thought. So you can do this with anything. I don't think it's just feminism,
Sure.
but there starts to be all these branches off of it, or all these subdivisions off of it, right? And I know that, I mean, maybe modern feminists today would have some disagreements or points of contention with Simone de Beauvoir. But I just wonder, it seems like a central focus here is, well, as a human being, how do we understand what it means to be female or what it means to be a woman?
Yeah.
And that is an ever evolving question as we move through time of, well, what is it may have meant something in when Wollstonecraft looked at it, but it's going to be different when Hannah Arendt looked at it, and then when de Beauvoir looked at it, and when Butler looked at it, and when on and on and on. It seems like, but do you see anything of like and maybe this isn't like a general answer to, it's too difficult to say that way, but in your mind, do you see anything that's kind of like a centralized core of what that is? And maybe there's no answer to that, but what do you think?
You mean a question what is it to be a woman?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, that's hard.
Yeah.
I think in distinction from male,
Mm-hmm.
central. Beauvoir would say that the other of the male,
Mm-hmm.
male is the
Yeah.
neutral. It's less obvious today.
Sure.
It's the case, for sure. I think there's an association with a certain kind of anatomy or performance or behavior in the world.
Yeah.
And I think following Judith Butler, there's this assumption that women are heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
So you might not be a heterosexual woman in an inclusive space. People would be fine with that.
Right.
But the assumption is that if you are a woman, you're heterosexual. So that's your defining purpose. I mean, there's some really interesting stuff that I am not 1,000% up on in neurology about trying to understand the differences between brains
Yeah.
of different kinds of genders.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting in feminist thought is to think about the early feminist thought had a distinction between this idea of nature versus social construction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think an early feminist idea was to perhaps overemphasize social construction so that it's all about how women are perceived in society, how we're determined, we want to control women in this and that way.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we've learned increasingly that women, people who identify as women, have certain brain chemistries. And so we have a certain natural predisposition that we need to react to that social construction with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that future research will kind of, marry those two things. So let's sort of think about what does it mean for women who identify as women,
Mm-hmm.
and how do they understand their experiences, broadly speaking, with other people and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think somebody like Simone de Beauvoir would have been totally up for that, and Hannah Arendt and all these other kinds of figures. And I think they would have, been interested in that intersection between the kind of societal views and the biological science. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely a long tradition and a long history that, obviously we should know and in some ways preserve, and then also try to understand, well, how are we having different types of conversations and discussions about, femininity and what that looks like. And I would say also in another way, I mean, not necessarily, not that it has to be in the same conversation, but what does that look like for masculinity as well, right? How do we understand that as well?
Question, yeah.
And there's, I think that it's interesting because you have a lot of traditional ways of understanding male, female, and that doesn't mean all of those traditional ideas are correct or accurate, I should say.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, how do we, as we keep evolving as a society, how do we continue to understand what these things are, and how do we look at them? Because they're fundamental, I think, or they're one piece of a fundamental way of understanding what it means to be human.
Yeah, when I teach this idea of becoming a woman in Beauvoir,
mm-hmm.
To my students, I actually don't talk about women. I talk about men.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about what does it mean to be a pussy or be weak or
mm-hmm.
And I talk a lot about this idea that men need to learn how to not be girls, not
mm-hmm.
be, and so because I find the students are super responsive to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The female stuff is sort of so background, so part of our culture, so part of. They're less. They don't absorb it as well. But the male stuff, think they're more receptive to. So I find that if I talk sort of about that issue of becoming a man versus becoming a woman, and I talk about how when, if you imagine a father says to a son, man up or something like that,
Right.
we don't mean something biological. We mean something performative.
Yeah.
So that's been super effective. And I have to say, my students are super receptive to that. In particular, the male students are super receptive to that because I think they've heard that a lot in their backgrounds and in their pasts. It's about manning up or being a man or whatever that might mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, on the masculine side of things, I think it's one of those things that I've also in different places where there's students, or I don't really teach on
Yeah.
this stuff, but sometimes it will come up where say like, look, there are traditional ways of being a man and all that, but I don't. We need to broaden our understanding of what our spectrum is of what masculinity looks like. So not all
Yeah.
men are going to do the traditional, fixing cars and skateboarding and,
Yeah.
lifting weights and liking sports. I mean,
Yeah.
that's totally fine if men like doing that. I mean, it is what it is. It's an interest. That's fine. But I think that there also needs to be the space of, and what also is masculine is if you
Right.
like doing art and you like,
Right.
reading books and you like to do other things, that's no less masculine, right? It's just a
Right.
different aspect of it. And I think those types of discussions need to be, I think, somewhat more normalized. We obviously grow and we evolve as a society in general as we know more things, as we're part of a digital age. We're not just going to be doing the traditional things. I think sometimes when people want to talk about what it means to be male or female, it almost feels like it has to be, in some circles, I think this condemning and eradicating of traditionalism. And I don't think it has to be that. I think that there has to be, some people are going to do that, and that's fine. That's how they want to identify. That's how they want to do things. Fine. I mean, that's your free choice. But I think that, so I think on both ends, people shouldn't diminish one way or the other. I think it should be like, okay, that's how you do things. That's one way of doing it. Not for me, or okay, but that's cool for you. And like, I think we have to just develop a broader spectrum of how we do things, because where I come down on it is kind of where I think probably Heidegger a little bit and Merleau-Ponty would say is, how are we accessing one's being more so, right? What is it to be, to understand your possessive being, and how are we allowing that to come out? And so I think there's a utility there with that. It's interesting though to hear that you do masculinity with de Beauvoir. That's a cool angle. I like that.
Do you think that people tend to misunderstand masculinity in our culture?
Well, I think it depends. I think a few things. I think it depends on what circles you're in, or what you're, who you're talking to. But
sure, yeah.
I think, I guess more globally, there's a lot of animus towards, I think, men in general, often. And I think maybe some of that's fair. I mean, men aren't always the best. You hear, I think when the Me Too movement was kind of at its height, you heard a lot of some appropriate disdain for men, but I think it became, like everything, a very absolutist general thing. And it's like, no, like there's some good dudes out there as well. And then you'll hear a lot of like, patriarchy and all of these things. And again, there is plenty to be said about that in a negative way. My question, which is true for a lot of things, is, okay, even if I go along with you on all these things, so what do we do different? Well, how do we understand what masculinity should be then? How do we create new norms then for that? And I always hear crickets. Or if people are trying to do that, if there are some people that are trying to say, how do we do, let's think about how we should talk to young men or just men in general. No, that's the wrong way. Or you're still doing these certain ways, or, and it's like, well, how do we do something where we don't have it that way and we have creation? And if you just want to, I'm fine with criticism, and some of that is definitely warranted. But how do we then create? How do we have an active way of talking about, kind of a modern 21st century masculinity and femininity? And I think sometimes it just becomes a lot of, criticism, very cynical. And then the end, and it's like, well, wait, we still have to like put this together. And I don't know if people are just gassed out at that point, or they just don't have an interest. They just want to be critical. So I feel like, in general, I feel like we don't have enough good conversations about the kind of active participatory piece of it.
Yeah, I think I could see that, because I think that one of the questions is that faces us is, if you're an existentialist, so if you're in this world where the universe is absurd, there is no meaning, there's no predestined way we need to be. We could continue to be the way we were before, but we don't need to be. And so how do we be? How do we interact with the world? And the way in which we're provided with certain meanings in the feminist tradition is that we need to react to this particular way of being, which I'm not sure is the right way to see the future. So that's one of the things I wonder about. Like, is it reactive, or do we want to be like, think of a new future in which we're proactive? I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, I agree. I kind of a little bit along those lines, both on both ends of this is I get really frustrated when one group has the megaphone and yells the loudest, and it becomes, get on the train or we're leaving the train station kind of attitude. And so, I'll say this with, people may criticize me for this, but I think in terms of feminism, I know plenty of people, I have friends, I have people in my family that are just kind of your very traditional kind of women. They buy into the traditional roles. And somehow that's not as included with kind of more cosmopolitan, modern feminists sometimes. And it's, they have an internalized patriarchal sense and, all these things. And I wonder if there's this way where we can have a type of pluralism, right? There's more than one way to see these things. It can't only be one way. It goes back to the thing we were saying before. If one person has the capacity to have some pretty abhorrent behaviors, but they can also generate beautiful art, wouldn't it be the same where you have men and women that maybe some of them will want to do aspects of traditional roles, fine, and then they won't want to do other aspects, and vice versa. And so I wonder if we're for the advancement of all, and for feminists, for all women, well, that would include those that think maybe a little bit differently than the mainstream thought. I don't know how people feel about that. I mean, I'm sure some people will
this was certainly a long-lasting issue in both Anglo-American and continental feminism, is that what do we do with the women who want to stay home?
Yeah.
And I think I don't want to say there's a conclusion about that. So one issue might be during the pandemic is women have exited the workplace in astronomical numbers because they can't raise their kids and educate them. And so is that a willing choice? Is that a choice that they've made because they want to make that choice? Or is it a choice they made because they need to take care of their kids and family? So that's something that I think in the pandemic is a questionable issue, that like, what is the way in which women are interacting with their families and choices and careers? Now, at the same time, in feminist thought, broadly speaking, the idea that women who want to retain traditional roles are less feminist is a problematic statement. Like, and something that Simone de Beauvoir and others affirmed, and I disagree with. So, if you want to stay home and raise your kids, that's great. And, you know. So I think you're raising a good question. Like, I mean, it seems like a question that's fundamentally social and political and economic. Like,
Yeah.
how do we, I mean, and also personal.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, as a mother who had a kid late in life, I was fully, able to think, like, maybe I don't want to work anymore. Like, I did end up wanting to work. So where do we provide the power for those women to not want to work? I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's I'm starting to feel the the eyes of like, well, now you're just mansplaining. So I promise I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a few things. So I think it depends on what types of jobs that some women have.
Yeah, sure.
So some women are able to. So I think it's two things at the same time. Depending on the job, some women can obviously raise a family and work.
Yeah.
I mean, plenty of women do that. But I also think this goes back to the other point, which is if you're doing let's just take a traditional nuclear family, two parent household.
Yeah.
Well, that would mean as well that again, I'll just use a standard model. The husband or father would also have to do things differently, right? If the wife wants to work, and it is not the wife works and then comes home and she has to do all the work with the home and the children. It should be, I'm not saying exactly 50-50, but there should be somewhere near that then. If I see this person as my partner and as my equal, and they want to work and take care of the kids if they have any, then I also want to work and I also have to take care of kids. Now, I'm not saying they have to do it in the same way. I mean, people can decide whatever they want for themselves. But I do think we have to have different, again, norms in our society about like, well, it's not you have to make a choice. If you want to do both, you can, and then I will help. And I've had plenty of clients, male clients, where they do that. They'll say, look, my wife works and she comes home and raises the kids with me. And we do that 60-40 or 45-55, whatever. I'm also, she's working late one night and then I'm on duty and I'm doing the laundry and I'm making the lunches and I'm doing all that. And then there's other days she does it. And it really is there's more equanimity there with the partnership. I mean, that's one way of doing it. And I would hope if we see really some equality of, between kind of males, females, that there is a little bit more of that. But that has nothing to say about plenty of the people that I know where the mom is a stay-at-home mom. The husband is the sole, quote unquote breadwinner, that's fine too. Or reverse. There's some
Right.
that they have their careers, they work really hard, and they want to do that mostly full time. And I think we just have to, I mean, that's kind of my whole point here is depending on, we should have this plurality of people can do what they want, how they want to do it. And we're inclusive genuinely of all that. But depending on that, how do we shape and fashion where, you know, the man isn't weak or his woman is doing the work for him, those garbage narratives where it's like, no, like I support my spouse, I support with their career as well. And I also help out at the house. And it really is a kind of unified effort. I think having more, again, norms in that way is even more advantageous for us in a society. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the issues that we face in our society is that the default is that women do stuff.
Yeah.
And so you will hear men who will say, I help out with the kids, I help out with the family, I help out with grocery shopping or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about the idea of helping out is that there's a pre-existing thing that's been done by the woman largely.
Mm-hmm.
You're just kind of contributing to that.
Mm-hmm.
Naturalist. Instead of like, it's obvious what needs to be done. You need to help. The kids need care. You need to go to the store. Somebody needs to cook dinner. I mean, all this stuff. And I think that the second shift, as often been described with women, is that all this stuff, like who's making dinner, who's buying the groceries, who's doing all this stuff, and it's not horrible. It's not onerous in a horrible way, but it's a long-lasting thing. So I think the idea that, I think one of the things that the men I would know and I'm a professional and I'm an academic, so, that I would know in my field or in my work, they might describe themselves as helping out at home. Mm-hmm. They're helping their wives, and I've been in a field where everybody I know is men. So they help their wives out. Yeah, they help their wives out by going to the grocery store. They help their wives out by picking the kids up. Mm-hmm. But I don't know a single woman who would say, I help my husband out by picking my kids up. Mm-hmm. 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 I pick my kids up because they need to be picked up. Because they're at school and they need to be picked up.
Yeah, yeah.
I go to the grocery store because we need to eat.
Right.
I help somebody out by doing it. I do it because it needs to be done. And so to me, this is a kind of a lived experience in a phenomenological sense that is vastly different. Now, on a philosophical sense, what's the import of that? Is it relevant? I mean, it's like buying groceries and taking kids to school and stuff. And that's something I think about a lot. Like, what is it relevant philosophically? Is it relevant for people who don't have kids? Mm-hmm. And who don't buy groceries? I guess who doesn't buy groceries? So I guess buys groceries. I guess if you have listeners who subsist off the land or whatever,
right?
And I guess I think that the relevance is that we're trying to figure out a way in which to understand our interconnectedness to other people. Mm-hmm. And I would say that because you asked me to talk about feminist philosophy, I think that feminist philosophy fundamentally is about that issue. Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally about the fact vastly and enormously interconnected to others. Our mothers, the people who raised us, the community we live in, the people who produce our foods, who are largely probably not, in my case of my ethnicity, the people who actually produce the goods I consume, probably in the global south. I think that's kind of the kind of key is that my identity, my capacity to sustain myself as Talia Welsh is based on all these other people who have nothing to do with me. Long-term philosophy has been about who am I and how do I think and what kind of person am I and and that's great stuff, but it's so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Disconnects us from this larger world in which somebody like Descartes or Plato or Anselm or Augustine or Kant could exist. Kant didn't make his own food. Somebody else made his food. And he ate it, so to me, I would say that's from my perspective, that's the heart of feminist philosophy. It's not arguing a particular view of the world, but it's pointing out that people like Kant and so forth lived in a world in which a lot of other people did a lot of their stuff and made Kant possible. Mm-hmm. And when he went for his walks in Königsberg at whatever 10 a.m. or whenever he did it, there's a lot of people, probably women, largely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think going to what you're saying about the first point about the home life is important. I totally agree with you. It should not be perceived as helping out. It's perceived as this is what you do, and we do this. There's a shared way of doing that, and so I think it's a mindset of things, and I think that's not to say there isn't division of labor. That's not to say that there aren't roles that people do of absolutely 100%. But I firmly agree with you that it is a type of mindset. And so that just goes back to what I was saying earlier about, how do we show that mindset or that way to young boys in that way where it's like, okay, how do we do that?
It's a good question.
And that's important, right? Because you don't want to say this is the ultimate way absolutely all the time.
No, yeah.
But I do think that is important to say, because it's less passive. It's less a duty. It's more of an active, participatory. There's ownership. There's responsibility. And I think that's important. And I think that leads to your other point of, I feel like there's always this. I think I made a tweet about it a couple of weeks ago about, I just feel like all conversations at some point always come down to this, individual versus collective, and I see that, but I think I think that it's definitely both, and I think we have to have both, and we have to have both well. And people that think they're in opposition or they're arch nemesis or whatever is it's just I don't think an accurate way of looking at it. I think it's I would probably say, for me, maybe other people see it differently. You probably want to start with the individual. I think it gets clunky if you try to do it the other way. That's just my opinion. So it's kind of like an onion. You start with the core of the person, the individual, and then you just move outward and you see the, how you interact with other people, and you can do that more effectively. Yeah. People disagree with that. That's fine. My thing would be, are we doing both? And I think that's what's really important. Are we doing both? Do we recognize that we have to do both? And that's really important. I think that's really important. Anytime I've traveled in the United States, and there's this, even for global listeners will know, there's this kind of push-pull of people on the coasts, big cities, people in the Midwest, people in the mountain regions. You know, I don't want government in my life. I don't want them telling me what to do. I don't want these regulations. I so hear that. And there's times where if you're in the middle of the United States, that is so far removed, right? Than if you live in New York or DC or Philly. And I will hear those arguments, and I totally get it. I'm sympathetic to some of them, but my thing is, yes, but all those things may be true, but you're also part of the United States as a country as well.
Yeah.
You're not your own country. You don't live on an island. Even the state that is an island is part of this country. So, you know, I think that maybe there's some flexibility there for sure. I hear that, but I think it is important to do both. You have to do both. And I think that's important. From the family to community to more national levels. I think that's very important. And so,
your comments make me think about so much about how I live in Tennessee, which is a fairly conservative state. I would say probably a very conservative state.
I don't know the last time it went blue. Politically.
And
it's a beautiful state. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's a beautiful place to visit. And you know, one of the things that's interesting living here is I do not experience some radical alienation as a largely secular feminist person. I have so many good connections with other people.
Yeah.
And even people with whom I probably differ quite greatly politically and I guess I would say ideologically or faith-based. You know, I don't believe in an afterlife myself, but I know a lot of people who do, and they are, you know, good friends of mine. And so one of the things that I think a lot about that issue and what triggers them and triggers me, I should say, and I should say myself too, because I'm triggered by stuff too. So we often tend to, I think in the left, see the faith-based tradition in the South as being triggered and us as being not triggered, you know, by certain news reports.
Yeah.
Is that I think that we find a real disagreement about what is the trajectory of a life that's well lived. What makes a life well lived? And so I think you think of certain movements against abortion, of course, the capacity for trans children to have treatments they've been having and will maybe have. And it's a lot about not so much what is right or wrong right now. And again, some laws are about that, like can we have guns or whatever.
Right.
But it's a lot to philosophically. What's interesting to me is about what is a good life? What's a good life for a child? And I think a lot about, since I have a child, and I think somebody who doesn't have a child could imagine, what would I want my child's life to be like? And so in my state, the answer, I think, will probably be in the short term, if your child feels that is trans child, they cannot receive treatment. And it's a very weird place to be, because it's not about like it's not about a specific thing that's happening right now, it's about a specific thing that's happening in the future. And I think one of the things that feminist theory can really bring to bear on that, and I know it's not going to answer it, it's not going to defeat it. The defeat is large and systemic and needs to happen at the ballot poll, and we're in a state that doing everything it can to limit voting, so that's not it's not going to happen there. But that intellectually is that people's identities are defined not just by thinking they're male or female, but they're also defined by thinking about what the future of their lives look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that this issue about trans persons and children, if my kid's gay or straight or whatever, it's not really about the kid as an entity. It's about what their life trajectory will look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that this kind of podcast and sort of thoughtful reflections can occur, is that there are a lot of ways to live a great life.
Absolutely.
And they're not all the ways that we've been told are the ways to live a great life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's kind of one of the things that I would like to bring to people, is that, like, it's not about like identifying whether or not trans or gay or straight or feminist or not feminist are right. It's more about like, what do you want to see your life be like?
Mm-hmm.
And that can get away from these identities. And so, I mean, I definitely identify as feminist, so I'm identity. But I think that one of the ways to get away from that identity is it's not so much about me identifying as feminist. It's like, my life looks like a life in which my trajectory of life is open to other possibilities than the ones that have been provided to women who don't identify as feminists.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like where I'd want to.
Yeah, no, I totally, I like your framing of it is, and I think that's right in at the very least in the abstract and maybe in the practical is, what kind of life? I mean, it is. I mean, it's very Nietzschean, which I'm super sympathetic to. Is how do you want to live an active life? How do you want to live in a certain way? How do you want to do that? And opening up yourself to all the possibilities that could be,
right?
I think it's appropriate, and I think in a variety of ways, for myself, is I become more and more open, and I become less rigid about things. And I have strong opinions about things. I certainly do, but I will say always, I have a strong opinion about this now, but I may not later. And that's okay for me. And I lived a life for probably, up to my mid 20s, which, I mean, I've always kind of been an intellectual, a thinker and stuff, but where I had very rigid kinds of structures and philosophies and ways in which to do things. And this was right and this was wrong. And as I became older and I had more experiences and I talked to different types of people and became slowly a little bit more open, I realized it is appropriate to have strong opinions, and it's important to fight for certain things, but also to remember for every single person to not forsake remembering their humanity and how that's going to be different than what you think. That's going to be messy. It's going to be complicated. But that we have that, and we can have strong opinions or strong disagreements, but how do we not forsake the humanity of someone and not forget that? Because I think pouring into someone's being and then how it connects with other people is really important, because you don't want to be so. Again, I've learned over time that it really is how you're interacting and approaching people, sometimes more than what you're saying. It's less than the content. And I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. It's like, no, this is the right way, this is wrong, the end. And it's like, yeah, sure, you can be right all day, but if no one's going to hear you, if they're not going to get to the message. And so finding ways, and you're right, some of the ways this podcast operates is, and just for me in general, in my personal life, and if anyone were to hang out with me in person, it'd be the same, is how do you how do I try to get the most human out of somebody in their interactions and more open to ways of being.
Yeah.
That's I think the ultimate aim. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, it's such a nice way to present it, and I think that we live in a culture now that in many ways I see as great. I'm happy about it. I would identify myself politically as a progressive, but I'm very I don't know if the right word is concerned about this idea of identifying that somebody said something wrong in the past and we're going to sort of lambast for them. And again, it depends on the person, so I think it's very contextual, and that's one of the things I come from in this existential tradition where it's very connected to the situation. So it's not there's no universals. You can't say this is always good or bad. Right. It's not always good or bad to do something or the other. And I sometimes feel that we've lost a little bit of that. It's always good or bad. And so the example that I've thought about a lot in retrospect is of Al Franken from Minnesota, who was a senator. And so again, I think it's okay. Is it okay to say my political persuasions on this podcast?
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah, okay. So I'm, leftist, I mean, largely. I always thought of myself as an independent. And for a long time, I briefly thought myself as a libertarian, but actually, I'm not that anymore. I'm definitely leftist. And I see myself as a progressive. But anyhow, so there's this story about this senator. His name is Al Franken. He was a character on Saturday Night Live for a while. And he, just for your podcast viewers who might not know the story, engaged in some, I would say, mild, questionable behaviors with women. Definitely questionable. So hugging them and stuff. So it wasn't anything that you would put somebody in prison for, but it wasn't awesome. And he was the party sort of encouraged him to resign, and he did resign. And I always felt very kind of questionable about that, because I thought that, he's not just that. He's not just those behaviors. And this is a question that comes up with Woody Allen and these other aesthetic sense, is that what is it that determines what the value of a person is? And to me, it would be overall their behavior. But then again, of course, there would be an individual behavior. If somebody killed somebody or something, that would not be their overall behavior. You would have to extract that. So this is this kind of on an existential sense, which I come from this philosophy and I've ascribed to still as a person, is that it's murky to decide the value of what an individual's contribution is or is not to society.
Yes.
It's just murky. It's a murky situation. And I think that as long as we make those decisions in the murky position and we decide they're murky, I don't want to say that maybe he should have resigned. Al Franken should have resigned. That's fine. I don't feel I have some definitive idea that he should or should not have resigned. But I feel that the decision for him to resign was not murky. And I would like that to be an ambiguous, murky decision. And I think that one of the things we've gone away from in our society is this desire to think about things in a murky position. To be like, I'm not sure about this, but maybe this film should be banned, or maybe this guy should be, so that's this idea of cancel culture. It's like, to me, it's like, canceling seems not murky. Maybe not watching it because it's morally questionable is a would be good. But so that's kind of my idea, is like something like murkiness, or I don't know what the right term is, but
Well, there's some ambiguity. There's some gray to it, which I think is
yeah,
true for a lot of things. And I mean, I 100% agree because, again, it's like what I said somewhere earlier in the
yeah,
conversation. My question always is, okay, fine. You want to penalize someone, we punish them, or they have to do their penance, whatever. Okay,
yeah,
fine. They go away for a while, fine. My question is, to me, it's a type of narcissism, where it's you did a mistake, and it was a bad mistake. It was bad.
yeah,
Okay, we can
yeah,
all agree on that. That doesn't mean the totality of that person
right,
can never re-enter society and do things. And my question always with these cases is, I hear the arguments. Okay,
yeah,
what's the redemptive quality here? How do we
right,
forgive? How do we redeem? And how do we say, okay, you paid your dues, you acknowledge this, okay, and you move forward, and we all move forward.
right,
Because, and the reason I say it's narcissistic is, name one person on the planet, past or present, that has not done something objectionable, that has not, to someone else, has not done something questionable. Like, there's obviously degrees of this stuff, right? You want to take your Harvey Weinstein's, yeah, it's criminal offenses. I mean, obviously, and
right, yeah,
there's a variance here, but so right. So Al Franken. So I'll just say for listeners, this was pre-Trump. The world was different. This was still Obama era, I believe.
yes. It's so
And,
different. The
and
world is
very different
entirely
world.
different.
And if I remember correctly, I could be wrong on the details, but so Al Franken was a comedian. He was on years on SNL, which, obviously is skit program, all this stuff. But he was a comedian. And comedians always are, I mean, since the 70s, at least, I mean, probably before that too, comedians have this strange way of, they kind of operate in their own orbit where they push the limits on things within each of their contexts.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You can think about Richard Pryor, you can think about Carlin, you can think about Robin Williams. In their time, they were all, I mean, people watch those stand-ups now and they're just like, white knuckling their chair.
Yeah.
Okay, they're always pushing the envelope, and that still happens today. Al Franken is from that world. Okay, I'm not excusing it, I'm not making it right, but it was gimmicks, skits, banter, satire, stuff like that. And I will, from my understanding, again, I could be wrong, but in that story, as a senator, I mean, he really cleaned it up.
So great.
Yeah, as a senator, he was very professional. I mean, I didn't work in his office, but
senior, and he was, yeah,
he was very professional. He meant business. He was able to really he's the senator from Minnesota, which is a blue state, but it has a heavy conservative population, and like he had a nice balance of things. And so the political side of this was, there was a special election, I think, for the Senate to get the majority with, was it Doug Jones in Alabama?
Yeah.
And that was happening at that time. And so when this came out, this was also right at the height of Me Too and stuff. My view of it was, Franken was the sacrificial lamb. He really had to fall on the sword on this one. He had to take the L for the team, and he did. And Doug Jones went on to win the Senate. They kept moving forward. But it was this, and kind of like you were saying, fine. If that made sense to do, fine. What bothered me was how people in his own party really kind of beat him up a little too much, a little bit below the belt, which wasn't, I don't think, right. And again, if I remember correctly, his offenses were
like hugging women too tightly. It was
hugging tightly. I think he was making some inappropriate jokes, not like, I mean, I don't remember all the jokes. I wasn't there for what people claimed. I think there was like some pictures going around where he was like feigning putting his hands on women, and like it was stuff that was like, yes, crossed the line, but he wasn't stalking women or something.
Yeah, but it was. I think that this is one of these things that I think today, if we think about, so there's like feminist theory that's very academic, and it's very removed from this kind of discussion. But I think that when we're thinking about something like these kinds of issues that become difficult, and are kind of real life issues, that one of the things I think about that particular example that's interesting is that what is, we're thinking about what is consent,
right?
What is reasonable at the time, and then I think what is the punishment that's appropriate.
Yeah.
And so to me, the things that came out in Al Franken's case that seemed egregious were basically handsy stuff. And having been a woman in a male-dominated field, that I remember seeing that, I was like, well, whatever, that's like stuff just happens, So, which is not okay, because
it's not okay. No, it's
women should not deal with that, and we don't want our we like people just hand to you and stuff.
It wasn't right. I mean, you're not saying
right,
that.
But
I'm not saying that.
And so I do think that this is one of these questions that has kind of come up, is sort of thinking critically about what is it that we want to advocate for when we're thinking about a kind of world in which women and men and transgender people can have a viable, happy, flourishing life. Can advocate for themselves in political spaces. And I still feel that we made a mistake in sort of demonizing Al Franken when we should have figured out a way in which, in the same way that the prison abolition movement has worked towards, again, it seems weird to make that comparison, but I'm going to go ahead and make it, because whatever. There has to be a way in which people who have engaged in questionable acts can say, listen, man, I did this thing and I did this activity and I realized it wasn't good and I need to move forward. Because especially I think now, when all of this stuff that we've done is all recorded online, what are we going to do for our kids and our kids' kids and stuff? We need to figure out a way in which to not assume that because there's this one image or this one picture or this one moment, and that we're going to make that decide the entire person's fate. And that, existentially, again, I think my increasing idea about existentialism and its ethics is that it's about acts. So you want to encourage trying to figure out, you want to figure out how you evaluate things, but you want to figure out how do you act in the future. And I think that's a really important, so if you want to be a feminist now, in a technologically sophisticated age where there's tons of documentation of stuff, and I feel that Al Franken, if you read about him now, is a guy who I kind of wish would have hung in there.
Well, and that's the other thing. It's like, we can condemn these acts. They weren't right what he did. Maybe take him off a committee. Okay.
Right, and maybe figure out how can he figure out a way to move forward with different acts.
Right.
So he's a little handsy and he does some, but I mean.
But when you think about it, in terms of okay, we can definitely agree.
Yeah.
Yes, what he did was wrong, and I think there's this. I could be wrong on this, but he did this pre-Senate years, right? I believe that's
Yeah.
the case. Okay, you know, fine. We understand this. He's apologized. We'll take him off some committees, but the work he was doing
I was so good.
for minorities and for women and for his constituents and for, I mean, he was trying to put in policies in place to really have equality and protections
Right.
and doing a lot of really good work. That's important too.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the issues that often when I talk to people and they want to ask about feminism, I was like, listen, feminism is not, we're not a bag. We're not a bag of people who all agree.
Mm-hmm.
Because I tend to be on these kinds of issues, I guess I would say fairly conservative, maybe would be the issue that, I mean, I tend to think that we need to, I guess I would say existential, because I
agree with that.
Subscribe to Hannah Arendt and Simone de Beauvoir's existential philosophies is that it's about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't a predetermined set of ethical obligations that we have.
Yeah.
We need to understand how we're situated in the situation, our obligations to other people. But I definitely am against the idea of kind of like blacklisting or, these are good and bad people. And I definitely, because of that existential point of view, I'd like to think of the redemptive possibilities for any person.
Of course.
Particularly
Of course.
the person advocacy movement.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which in the United States, I mean, people have just been condemned to these infinite prison sentences forever. And to me, like, who would learn from 50 years in prison? I mean, you don't.
No, yeah.
You can't be redeemed. You can't find a new sense of self.
No, not there.
I definitely get that if it was my friend or colleague or beloved one who died, I would want the person to be sentenced to a bazillion years in prison. But
of course, yeah.
I think that abstracted from that personal point of view, why not present a vision of prison where these people could find themselves and existentially and choose a different world in which they want to live, and probably do want to live in another world. I don't feel like people who are doing these things want to live in that world. So that's kind of my kind of vision, is that condemning people because of one statement or grabbing somebody one time, it just seems wrong in my mind. So yeah,
and it's, the person you like today could be the person you hate tomorrow because you find out something. It's like, well, where's the bottom to that, and then the second thing is like, well, we're blacklisting or condemning or canceling all these people, but they don't go away. And what usually happens is they just run into the arms of people that do accept them.
Right.
And that's sometimes a bigger problem, because you want to be I mean, being inclusive of people is to say, look, I accept you for who you are. We do not accept these behaviors or these actions, but you know what? Get some treatment, get some rehabilitation, maybe take a break, go away for a while, and then we accept you back. If things are there, and that when I see on all sides of political spectrum, for the most part, I mean, that's what I feel like a lot of people want, because everybody knows that could be me.
Right.
And that's the problem. It's like, yeah, this person, made a mistake. Okay. But, like with Al Franken, or you can think of Kevin Spacey. I mean, I think that's such a heartbreaking story on all counts.
Yeah.
He's a phenomenal actor. And he definitely has his demons. He definitely is very troubled, and he has a very, very tough and he's been away for a long time now. But there's other folks. I mean, even
Yeah, you think about even somebody like, I remember talking to my husband about George Floyd and Derek Chauvin's, and so it got me interested, like, what's up with this family? Because I imagine they are super scrutiny.
yeah,
And I thought about, like, how the extensions of all of us, those of us who we might be able to say are horrible, you in every respect, like you end up involving other people that are not
they don't want to be involved, or
accessing or acknowledging or so I think that's to me from a feminist existential point of view, a very relevant consideration is that you need to, and I'd say in large in feminists that there's this idea of the personal as the political. So I want to think about the personal way in which you interact with things. And so similarly, that if you live in a culture in which police violence is, in the case of Derek Chauvin, in the case of George Floyd, that it's a viable thing that could happen every day, this actually is a relevant philosophical consideration. But likewise, I think in the cases we're thinking about, that the personal is complicated. It's not immediately easy to say this is right or wrong, or this is good or bad. And I definitely think that that there's as Hannah Arendt would say, that we live in a society that's very focused on what she calls cognition. So cognition is thinking to solve a problem. So we solve, I want to figure out how to produce a widget or a car, or I want to figure out how to solve a crime. But to her thought, true thinking is endless. And we're afraid of that in our society because we're so focused on work and labor. And I think that's a we think, like, we see something like systemic racism and we want to solve it immediately. And what I think Hannah Arendt would say is that we need to, like, be okay with just thinking, and allowing the thought to not tomorrow have a solution. Like, just just letting it. I would say that in general is true of philosophy. Like, we need to allow thought a space in which to develop, without requiring a preset solution to that thought.
Yeah, no, I totally would agree. I did want to ask you about a little bit of Hannah Arendt and then about work in general, if you want. Yeah. I know you've been more interested in this topic, so it's a nice segue into this about work. Maybe before we do any, I guess, of the of her ideas or whatever, just what is it that's been most pressing on your mind recently about work and how we think about it from a philosophical or phenomenological basis?
Yeah, I think my fundamental thought about work has been, in an isolated point of view, is the idea of working on the self. So there's a lot of different ideas of work. So there's work as labor in a factory or in your work. But I'm interested in this idea of that work as a project of thinking of myself as an object of labor, and trying to create a different self in the future. And this can be super productive and great. Like, if you think about, like, I don't know, writing a book or a novel, or achieving some fitness goal or running a race or whatever. So I don't think it's bad, but just that's my particular interest in the idea of work. But I am largely interested in the idea of work in general, too, about the idea of paid labor. And just as a university educator in a marginalized field, my students are very interested in what will I do to earn money. So I'm interested in that level of work too. But academically, I'm more interested in that smaller level of like working on the self.
Well, so I'll start with the first one. I like the framing of it, which maybe other people may not, but I think it's the quote unquote right way of thinking about it is, yes, to work on yourself is just that, is work. There is a sort of labor.
Yeah.
That is a labor of love. It can be, or it could also be of misery some days or some weeks.
Yeah.
What do you think at the current state of where people are at? Do you think, I'm just going to very general, just people in general. Do you feel like people just don't think about it, or they think about it with a different lens? Or how do you see it as the lens you're using is work, which I totally am in agreement with you on, but how do you think in general people approach it, or what lens they look at, or if they do at all?
Well, so the sense of working on the self is a very bourgeois, middle upper class view, and I got really interested in this idea of work on the self because of a kind of rise of fitness diets, tech hacking culture on the self in the last couple of decades. So this idea that, and this is a rarefied group of people, so this is not people in general, but this idea that you want to see yourself as a product to be evaluated and monitored. And in feminist theory, there's a long-standing tradition on dieting as a way to monitor and evaluate yourself as an aesthetic object. So I was interested in that tradition, but the new stuff is really interesting in my mind because it's about really minute levels of performance, both fitness level and productivity, I would say. And there's a whole kind of like tech boom of like, I mean, the Fitbit's one example of that kind of monitoring the self as a level to be worked on. I do want to say I am appreciative of the generative possibilities of this, of the pleasures and joy of working on yourself, of refining your diet and having a great diet and realizing like, oh man, I feel so much better because I'm working out more or I'm eating better foods or, so I don't want to, my work in general on work is not this idea that work is inherently always oppressive. But I'm very interested in that idea that work is a thing that individuals in general work on the self for health is something that they should do. Mm-hmm. And that I find really, really interesting because I think it's very different than previous times where work is regarded largely as a burden. Mm-hmm. Like you work because you gotta work, because you gotta earn some money, but then in your spare time you'll just do whatever you want to do. But I think increasingly for middle class and upper class people, in your spare time you work on yourself. Mm-hmm. And if it's not too oppressive to say, but like you do a podcast, you push things about people thinking things, and like you don't just like hang out, you just like you do other things. You play. My husband plays music. I have friends who competitively knit. You put stuff on Pinterest. Like this idea that your life is a constant production outside work, outside paid work. So I
That's
became really interested in that. Yeah, that kind
yeah,
of concept of work in
yeah.
particular.
That is hearing you spell it out is really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. Um, so I guess the one question or that's popping out to me on this is, well, have those things always been work, but they weren't framed that way? They weren't
Yeah,
labeled that way, or I mean, I definitely agree. There's almost like there's a shift that I agree with you. There is some shift with, middle to upper middle class folks of yourself or things about yourself is work, or it's a chore, or it's a thing you're doing, or it's you're meeting a goal, or you're meeting an objective, and it is sort of kind of in that
yeah,
way work, which is probably different than what it was. And I think that is, if you're looking at that lens, that's probably something that has sort of evolved. And then, right, in a capitalist society, there's money being made off of that. So, I mean, there's that lens of it too. But, I wonder, just kind of in that way, how do I'm trying to frame this. Has it always been work and we just haven't seen it or framed that way? Or it isn't work in
yeah,
itself? So is it in the thing of it, the content of it, is that a type of work, right? So maybe it's a
yeah,
dimension of work, or is it not? And you're doing
yeah.
things because
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
go ahead.
you're raising the question that is at the heart of what I'm thinking about, and I don't have an answer to it. I mean, I think there's an existential issue in my mind, which is, I mean, with some modicum, if I live a life which is not a sheer survival life where I'm just trying to eke out an existence and every day is just trying to make that thing happen, and have some wherewithal to think about my life, then I think about what I want to work on. Like, what do I want to do? What do I want to think about? What do I want to study? What do I, again, depending on what world you live in. So I think there's this valuable and I should say really important value of work
Yeah.
that makes us who we are and makes our lives worth living. It makes us our lives not just I am I'm a living thing eking out a survival. It makes Talia. Like my work, I would say, broadly speaking, and I wouldn't just say my work in philosophy, but my work as a mother, as a partner. That's me. That's who I am. That's my little space in this universe.
Right.
Super valuable. But there's this other part of work, like you say, which is just kind of like this commodification of my labor, and it's tracked and monitored, and it just feels like. And then you think about I teach at a university, and people always ask my students, like, what are you going to do after you graduate? And they mean, what are you going to do to earn money? They don't mean
Right.
what you're going to do. Who are you going to be? Who are your relations going to be? What's your life going to be like? What do you value? What do you have religion? Like, they don't ask any of those things. They just want to learn how much money you're going to make. And that to me is so reductive and so horrible and so minimal if you think about a human life. Like, a human life is short and minimal. And of course, we have to earn money to pay our rent and stuff. But
Right.
that question I find so reductive and horrible for students because they're so concerned about that question. And they don't think about, what do I value? Is my faith tradition valuable? Do I want to follow that faith tradition? I live in a very faith tradition based
Sure.
culture, so
Yeah.
right now, and so I think that's a question I find a lot of my students struggle with. But people are just like, how much money you're going to make. Like, it's all about this instrumentalization of work. So I find that question really problematic because I do think this valuable thing of thinking about yourself as a person in this universe. You can choose the relationships, the way you want to relate to the world. It's so great and fabulous. It's the best thing of being a human. But then there's just this other way in which we're just forced into this. So I feel like we want to maybe have two words. Like, so in Simone de Beauvoir thinks about this idea of projects. So sometimes I think it's valuable to think projects are the things like you sincerely are invested in, like your relationships, your the things you really love. Maybe it's part of your paid labor, but maybe slightly part of it, and then work, might be another thing, like thing you're actually paid for. So I feel so torn about that issue that you raised. I would just feel so torn about because I feel like I do not want to see us as just a natural being that just is like a fungi in the universe and we have no.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to see us as like just a thing that has to produce for this current social economic situation we live in. And to me, I think most people, if they were on their deathbeds, they would talk about their relationships and the work they really loved, and like we want to affirm that, like that's existentially valuable, like they're that part of them, and it might be their faith traditions too, but that part that they really invested in, loved, and saw themselves in.
Yeah, I really like the question, and it also is causing me a lot of it's a head scratcher for me as well, because I feel the tension between the like, well, what is this thing, like, I feel like we're both trying to crack the same nut from different sides. I'll say a few things on this. So it might be a terms or a semantic thing. It may be that, but like when I think of work in a general sense, everything has the potential for it being potentially classified as work. So as an example, if I have a friendship, if I have a marriage, my family, other relationships, I'm putting levels of work into that to make it function, because nothing is static. Things are always moving. They're always in process, right? And you have to have it, like, I see there's this kind of the action piece of it when you're trying to create is connected with work. I don't know if you can create without work. You may. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that if you want a healthy marriage, you have to work at that. If you want a healthy friendship, you have to work at that. So what does that mean? Do you call? Do you text? Do you write? Do you hang out?
Right.
Do you do different things? Do you make suggestions? Do you not? Are you there? Do you listen? Do you give advice? Do you not? That's a type of work. You can't just be not invested or not doing a part in there. I mean, you can, but you're not going to be married very long. You're not going to have many friends. You're not going to, right? You just be like, this person sucks. So I think there's this active participatory piece of it. But even in other things, like if you think of people that do gardening, I mean, that's work, but there's something, I guess I guess maybe the other piece of it is, I guess I'm sure there is in some ways, but there's at least two types of work,
Yeah.
which is, I don't know how to conceptualize this, but maybe like work for the others, such as a job or a boss, and then work for yourself.
Yeah.
That's not a great framing of it, but like take an example, gardening. There's something where when you start to see the creation but you have all the suffering and stumbling blocks and all the tough parts, but when that starts to kind of lapse into the creative part, it becomes less of an idea of labor and work and more of a process of creation, which is a part of that. And then it becomes potentially something that that whole experience, you can't get the flourishing, you can't get the elevation, you can't get that experience without all of those other parts. Because let's say let's as a thought experiment, let's say you throw a couple seeds in the ground and you do nothing with the plants or the vegetables or the fruits or whatever you're growing. And let's just say in this alternative universe, it just grows. And it's just, you have the flowers, you have the vegetables, you have the whatever. There is something that would be missing. You wouldn't probably enjoy it as much. It's like we both have doctorate degrees. If everyone just gave me an A on every paper and every exam, and then they gave me a paper at the end, I would be like, well, this doesn't mean anything, right? But no, the wherever my diploma is in my house, man, there's blood, sweat, tears, long hours, sacrifices, missed events that's in that thing over, total 15 years or whatever it was. That's the value we place into the work and the meaning. But all that being said, right?
Yeah.
There's a few other things here. So I definitely agree. This has to be some kind of like, there's like a motivation kind of piece to this, or some type of veiled motive of sorts. I'm not sure how to say it, but there will be people that in their personal lives, they will construct it just like they do their professional lives. So here's what I mean. I go to yoga class, I go to spin class or whatever. I have my brunch, I have my my coffee date, I have my therapy session, I have my, and it becomes very much routine, so much that the purpose or value of each of those things is lost there in the creative aspect of it. And it is too performative in some ways of, things create. So you're using the example of like a Fitbit or one of these watches or whatever. Wonderful invention, wonderful thing to use. There's so many things that from a behaviorist standpoint and a marketing standpoint, that's so powerful and so helpful. However, it always is walking a tightrope, because if it tips on one side, you're a prisoner to that, right? I didn't close all my rings. I didn't do all my steps. I didn't, oh my goodness, and that's feel worse.
Yeah.
Or the opposite.
Yeah. I'm not happy in my job. I haven't achieved this level I wanted to achieve. My relationship isn't the way the other people's relationship.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, to me, and this is something I've been writing about right now. So of course, when you're writing about something, it's always like right there, right?
Right.
But so, I come from this line of existential thinking. So people like Nietzsche and Camus, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, Beauvoir, and I think Arendt as well, who think that what's happened at the late 1800s to the turn of the 20th century, is that we've been freed from, both for philosophical reasons as well as existential lived human reasons, given the massive wars in Europe. So again, this is very, I should say, very localized. Sense that I don't want to make any general claims about the human condition as such, but the human condition in the European perspective and perhaps the North American perspective. And increasing secularization, so increasing emancipation from religious doctrine. And has led us to be groundless. There's no, what is life worth living? Well, who knows? Because it's just this thing. It's just this. There's no life after this. And the one hand, that's fabulous because, oh my God, like that whole heaven and hell thing seems kind of, for many of us, kind of difficult. Like, I'm going to hell forever, heaven forever. It seems kind of horrible. Actually, either one seems kind of horrible. What do I do in heaven forever? But hell definitely seems bad. But on the other hand, makes us kind of formless without space and time and understanding of what's valuable. And so I think that one of the things that they all draw out is, how do we situate our individual, like as an individual person who believes this? So if I believe, which I actually do, so I actually am living this existential experience. I don't, I mean, it's possible, but I don't believe there's a God or anything. And maybe there is a God, but he's not revealed himself to me, so I'll wait for that to happen. What do I do with my life? And it has this kind of shape, this kind of formlessness to it. And I think that this is this kind of fundamental question of existentialist philosophy, is that, well, what then do we do? On the one hand, it's super useful for things like feminist philosophy, because we can be like, hey, we don't have to abide by any of these masculine prescriptions because, screw that, There's some really great parts of it. But on the other hand, it kind of leads you with a kind of ephemeralness, like kind of vagueness, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
And there's different views to it. And one of the ones that I like a lot is Hannah Arendt's view about thinking and human condition. And she points out that thinking all along has been true thinking. She differentiates cognition is when you want to think about solving a problem. Think about, like, I want to solve infrastructure or peace in the Middle East or whatever, or Afghanistan. Like, you want to solve a thing, you try and solve it. Thinking is open. It has no end and doesn't solve itself. And so to me, one of the issues with our current condition is that how open are we to thinking and its openness? And how can we encourage people to be okay with thinking and openness? So to her, thinking is the advent of the new. It does not it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't solve something we need to solve. That's cognition. So solving, it's valuable, of course. We want to solve things. Thinking is structurally different. So it's just open-ended thinking. And that she ties it up with natality, the birth of the new human. And Arendt is not at all an embodied thinker. She doesn't think about pregnancy or anything. Just a concept, But just, and I love that idea. I love the idea that, like, thinking is just, it's not solving things that need to be solved. It's just, and for her, fundamentally, it's thinking something like this podcast that you do. It's like an exchange with other people. And you say things, and I say things, and other people think things, and then the new thought arises from that.
Right. Because
It's not pre-decided. We don't know what's going to happen. We
right.
don't. And if we went into it deciding what we needed to solve, it's not thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree. And I think for many things, we need that kind of mode, or I guess
Yeah.
modality of I guess doing things. So tying this into kind of work on the self, it's less about how do I arrange my personal life and the way I do my professional life, where I have all of these things and all these benchmarks and all these objectives. It's what am I going to explore? What am I going to find? So I'll give an example.
Right.
Many times people will tell me, oh, I'm just so just burnt out from work. And, you know, that's a real thing, right? We all get that. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to travel. Okay. Pre-COVID, obviously. Okay. And then they would go and they travel for a week or two and come back and give it 2 weeks. And they're already like, man, I just need to get out of here again. You know, it's just like, you know, and it's, and you can, there's the empathic side, which is like, wow, this person is really feeling it. They're really feeling life. They're feeling their work, but they're feeling life. And not the best ways. And then it's, well, how do you have your travel experiences crystallize? How do they,
Right.
how's there some sedimentation that happens where it can stick with you and have a longer half-life, if you will, and then able to edify your living day to day. So you're not just looking for the next trip, as you know, this kind of, that's not tenable. And I think it's very hard for people to find that. And I kind of agree, right? This kind of the formlessness of life post religion and what some of the existential thinkers had. You know, I was at, I think it was Dostoevsky, right? It was, you know, if God is dead, everything is permissible, right?
Yeah.
And he's right. I mean, he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And there are some wonderful things about that. There's some wonderful things about that. But, and it doesn't necessarily have to be religion. It has been for our evolution as a human species, but we have the cultural ways in which we evolve of how do we have ways as social creatures to structure and organize our lives. And religion was a very powerful way of doing that. And you know, it still does, but for many people in the world, I mean, obviously religion still exists, but for many modern or kind of in a general way of saying liberal way people, it's like, yeah, I don't need to believe in an afterlife and God and all these things, but there's, okay, that's, I think, a net positive, but what is not replaceable of sorts, or it is, but it's just very hard, is now where do I find direction, meaning, value? And I think there's this leap, or this, you can kind of see it where it's, well, what's the presets already in my life? Boom, work. Okay, so people will over-identify their being and who they are and how they do or do not perform in their professional or work lives. And I think this is, you know, if you just take a very broad lens view of this, there are many negatives to that. I don't think it's all negative, but the totality or majority of that is not right. I mean, you love what you do. I love what I do. I love my profession. I love my career very much. I work very hard for it. I love what I do, right? But I, you know, have a podcast where there's, you know, obviously some work that goes into it. I have played music. I'm really avid tennis player, and I'm always like, it's a challenge, and I'm competitive, and I like doing it. And like, I spend time with my family. I do things like, there are so many, like, when I'm not working, I'm not really thinking about my job.
Yeah.
I'm doing all my other things, but the thing is that they both integrate.
Right.
My job helps me do that. My personal life helps my job. There's a way in which it connects. And I feel like, I don't know how that is for you as well, but sometimes I think people get too wrapped up in an either or, is kind of this Kierkegaard thing, right?
Yeah.
You know, the inner and the outer kind of thing.
Right. And I've been thinking about, and perhaps other people fundamentally study this, and I guess maybe I might too, but that, the rise of kind of anti-science, anti-vaccination, skeptical of the government, these movements that have been motivated by certain, I guess, would say sources. I don't want to call them. So I don't want to call them news sources, but sources.
Sources, yeah.
And that okay, there's a lot to critique there. You could talk about science literacy, which people have talked about a lot. You could talk about kind of isolation and group identity. But to me, I tend to think of these views as fundamentally about desiring a kind of cohesive meaning. One of the things that science facts do not provide us with, that I would argue this, and that other people would not argue this, but they do not provide us with meaning. Does the statistics on vaccination provide us with meaning? No. They definitely, if you're a rational person, provide us with you should get vaccinated. Like, from my perspective, but they don't provide us with a fundamental human meaning of why this is valuable.
Do they have to?
No, I don't think they do.
Uh-huh.
I think that one of the issues that I think existentialist philosophy in my mind brings up is that one of the abysses, when Nietzsche says you stare into the abyss, the abyss stares back into you, is in the madman and the death of God piece, is that when you are removed from a traditional, maybe religious, it doesn't have to be religious, but it could be some other traditional source of meaning, it's open. It's open. It's wildly open. It's horribly open. It's not a good open. It's like a terrifying open.
Yeah.
And so I don't think sometimes the vaccine resistancy in our country is sometimes interpreted as a lack of understanding of science, which I think definitely there's a certain proportion that is that. But I think even more scarily, from an existential point of view, vaccine resistance might be, it's not that I don't understand science, it's that I don't give a shit about it. Like, I don't care that this is what contributes to it. Like, I refuse to accede to the meaning of this thing. And so in our state, we're passing a law, probably in our state legislature, that you can just opt out of vaccines for religious reasons. And again, I find this ridiculous because why would you opt out of vaccines?
Right.
But I do think on an existential level, it kind of makes sense because it's kind of like they have a preset sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And the meaning is valuable and coherent.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, take this thing, the government tells you to take it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't intersect with your meaning. And then people are like, science, and it's like, what? That doesn't, so I think, in this sense, I think the existential view is really valuable in that it doesn't solve the problem, but it kind of identifies the problem as that if you engender a scientific, secular world, and you create that world, we're all kind of adrift. And we have to figure out what we find meaningful and valuable in that world. And for some of us who are, bourgeois and sophisticated and have other investments, it's easy for us to figure it out.
Yeah.
But I think that for many of us, it's not easy. And I think that the kind of backlash against feminism is a similar thing. It's like, I would have never expected 20 years ago that there would be this backlash against feminism. I'm like, what? There are people, we should all, but it's real and it's viable. And transgendered people is the same thing. It's just, but again, it's like, if people don't have a coherent sense of what makes their lives valuable, they're easy to catch on to the nearest thing that grabs them. And the anti-transgender movement to me is kind of a weird thing. It's like, how much a percentage of transgender people in this population are? I mean, it's just such a weird thing to even care about statistically as a legislature, but it has become a big thing in this culture, and I think it is because of this vacuum of values or meaning. So it's definitely it's like 9:05, and I've got big ideas right now. The later in the evening, the bigger the ideas. But yeah,
I love it.
I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like
No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I was going to say the framing of it is really nice because I think that's exactly what it is, because if people don't feel like they have meaning, they're going to find it. They're going to find it in something.
Yeah.
They're going to find it in someone. And that is I think that's something that is endogenous to us as humans. I just think that's what's innate with us. We're meaning seeking creatures, and we're going to find that. And I 100% agree with you. If someone has a meaning structure, right, in the form of religion or some kind of religious thought, it's not right. It's not that any of these people are dumb. They're quite brilliant. They're really smart folks around the country, around the world. I'm not going to, just endless virtue signaling for scientific facts like all these other folks are. I don't need to do that. I don't need to. I have my virtues. I have my value. I have my meaning. And so it's less. I totally agree with that framing. I think it's less important for many people at that level, and I do think for many people there is a type of this fetishizing about science. Psychology is a social science. I've done empirical research. Like I am a very 100% big proponent of science, but it doesn't. It's a method. It is a means to. It's a bridge to get you from a hypothesis, to some results to see if it's testable and it's provable and okay. But it's not infallible, and it doesn't always give you meaning. It's just telling you something about the world. And I do think that people that kind of really kind of obsessively almost worship the scientific method or the scientific facts or science, that there's something odd about that. And I do think it comes from this kind of this chasm of sorts of they don't have maybe as much meaning. And so they see the power of science, and science is powerful.
Yeah, they want to use
infallible.
it. Yeah, Nietzsche calls this scientism.
Yeah.
As others do. And I think they want to use it as a tool to oppress those that disagree with them.
That certainly does happen.
Yeah.
That certainly does happen.
Yeah, and it's sort of it's like there's no necessary requirement. I mean, if I go to the doctor and I find out I have a terminal illness, of course, horrible, and I'm not happy to hear it. But what value I invest in that is my own.
Yeah, right.
And that scientism suggests to me that no, I can't invest my own value in it. But of course, there's no other value than my own. I mean, medical science has no relevance other than human people. I mean, it's not an abstract science. It's not like cosmology or something. It's like a science that's devoted to curing and solving the problems of human people.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the kind of issues of that we live in this world in which some, and I definitely think not all, but some people, when use science as a tool, aggravate those who disagree with it. But I think it's super ineffectual, because I think the people who disagree with it are not disagreeing with science, they're disagreeing with the value of science. And that's a super different perspective. I mean, so I had students who went and studied this creation museum in Kansas. I don't know.
It's Ken Ham's Creation Museum. Is it
somewhere, yeah. And
maybe
they were
Ohio?
saying
I can't remember where it is. It's somewhere
it's
in
super bananas. They were saying it's like crazy, but they said it's interesting that the museum embodies in a minor sense the ideas of science. They don't say this is what God told us, blah blah. They say this is what God told us, but here's all the quote unquote scientific fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that they want to embody the idea of facticity without actually really doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is like, again, I think fundamentally existentialist philosophers that we are both facticity. We're both things that we're both factual beings and lived beings, and I have this limited life and this body that's, it's got these issues. But then I'm also capable of thinking outside my body.
Mm-hmm.
And so a museum like that, if it just appealed to the super religious, nobody would see it.
Mm-hmm.
They're just like, Jesus said this, or I don't know, God or whatever said this.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to appeal to kind of our facticity, but then it's this kind of mystified way, like.
Yeah. No, this is in terms of this, I mean, for fundamentalists, as a formal fundamentalist, I mean, they're absolutely right in their reading probably of the Bible. I mean, it's probably right in how it's read, but it's wrong with the reality of the world. Right? So it does not compute. And so what usually happens is like it happens with inside the system and then external with this outside the system is a lot of gymnastics that are done to make it fit because it's from on high and the whole thing.
Right.
But
right.
I think this is one of my biggest issues with really all religion is, I can respect people that have their religious beliefs and it gives them a lot of meaning. And most people are very nominal believers. They're not, reading the text every night. I mean, there's some people that are, but some people it is a very extensive community and there's some type, fine. But for the fundamentalists, I mean, the really true believers here, for most religions, my problem with it is the fact that they're taking supernatural rules and applying it to the natural world. And it's like, no, if you want to play in this world, if you want to play in the natural world, you have to use the rules that everyone's playing by. And I always assign it like it's like playing tennis without the net, or it's like trying to play a tennis match and there's one person on this court and there's another person on the other court. You're not playing the same game. You're playing a different game, and you have to play the same game on the same court and abide by the same rules. And the reason this is that as soon as you get into any kind of discussion or dialogue with folks that are fundamentalists, and they will quickly say, well, that's how it is. That's why you have faith. That's what the Bible says. That's what God says. And it's like, fine. I mean, you can believe that.
Yeah.
No disrespect towards that per se, but again, the rules of the scientific world or just the natural world, we have to at least get there. And the problem is that it doesn't get there.
I would say even the non-reflective human world. Mm-hmm. If a tragedy befell my family and my child died, I have this question, or myself, or my husband, or a loved one who dies, I guess, quote unquote, earlier than I would expect,
Right.
I would be like, why?
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody said, because God willed it, I'm like, no, that super doesn't answer it. That answers nothing.
It's a non-answer.
Nothing.
It's not
I mean, it answers I mean, if the doctor comes and says they have this cancer, it's fast developing, and here's cancer cells, I'm like, okay, so that answers something, but it doesn't answer the fundamental why, because I'm not actually fundamentally interested in the biological question. I'm interested in this existential question.
Right.
Why are we beings that are subject to these short lives that are fragile, and all these things can happen to us? And to me, the religious answers don't provide an answer to that
Right.
limited the limited life perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, okay, maybe they suffer and they go on and live in this afterlife, and that great, I guess. Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, definitely that seems better than nothing, I guess. But it doesn't answer why are they suffering now? Like why is a hurricane kill all these people? Like that doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, they go into this afterlife and it's great. Well, that's something.
Right. But why do you need all that to get there?
Yeah, like why did this particular thing? Yeah.
Right.
So I definitely agree with you that to me always has seemed this fundamental, and even I remember as a young child, it seemed this fundamental problem. And I know that Peter Singer and Bertrand Russell and others have talked about this, is that it seems to them that people that they really have great affection for and are really sympathetic to, but when it comes to religion, they turn their thinking off.
Yeah. Well,
But again, I've met religious people, and they talk about that too. And reading Kierkegaard makes me think that
right. But
you believe this, you need to just kind of accept. You have to make this leap.
Yes. Well,
And again, as somebody who's not been, I think it's a kind of affective leap rather than an intellectual leap. I think it's that you have to have because I don't feel any. Why would I do that? Like, why would I leap into the void of faith? I don't get that. But again, I think people who do feel that, it's like a emotional connection to the universe or to nature or to.
For
whatever.
a lot of these folks, it really is this kind of way of, I don't want to let go of something I was raised in, or I don't want to let go of this structure, or I don't want to let go of how this makes me feel. So I'm going to do kind of the light version. It's kind of like Diet Coke.
Yeah.
Like, I get all the same kind of things, sort of, but it's, less calories. I mean, it is kind of, it is kind of like that, because it's like, okay, so if we're doing all of that, I mean, I'm not saying that you couldn't read it in 21st century United States or wherever, but why do we need to know all of this Jewish history and all of these kings, and why do we need to know all of this stuff from the Old Testament? Oh, fine. You don't want to read the Old Testament. You just want to read the Old New Testament and get your applied, wisdom for the day. Okay. Why do you need to read about, again, first century ideas about women, slavery? Fine. If you want to ignore those or find another way to jump around that, if you go through,
that's such a great point. Yeah.
Romans, and we're all sinners. I mean, you can do this in different ways. We're all sinners. We need a savior. There's only one way. You get to heaven in all these ways. There's still in Hebrews, in Romans, in Corinthians, in Ephesians. I mean, Paul was part of the Sanhedrin. He was essentially, he was, essentially a Sadducee, I believe. One of these Jewish thinkers. There's Judaism in the New Testament, 110%. You can't divorce it from that. But even if you do, right, again, how many leaps have I been making? Then you have to say, wait a minute, fundamentally, right, and philosophically, I'm going to view human nature as, hamartia is, sin, right, the Greek word, missing the mark. By inherently, it is fucked. Well, I don't think that that's one way of looking at it. You're putting an attribution, you're placing a value on something that, if you take the nihilistic view, is you can't say that one way or the other. You can't say it's more value or less valuable. You have to find that. But you're saying, no, endogenous, to be human is to be flawed. And I mean, we have flaws, but you're placing a value from the start, which you can't from first principles really make. And then it's, well, you don't look to yourself. You have to look to someone else to get that. And they're the ones that save you. And then you have to do all of these ways of doing it. I mean, even if you take the doctrine of salvation, even if you take the doctrine of, he was a propitiation for our sins, all these things, it's still externalized. And you still have to make philosophical leaps. How many leaps did I make? There's the scientific leap, the philosophical leap, there's the textual leap.
Ontological leap. You're going to like believe in this universe that's so composed. Yeah.
It's just too many leaps. You can do it on so many layers.
Right.
And again, all of that is fine, I guess, for some people. My thing is, well, you're having to do all these leaps just to get your words of wisdom. Well, then read Shakespeare. I mean, read Aristotle. Read if you want to get your wisdom. That's fine.
There's this concern in 20th century, late 1800s and early 1900s literature that, oh my gosh, like, so if we do this, if we divorce ourselves from this tradition, well, we're just in this abyss of meaninglessness. But I think that later thought and really points out that no, like, I mean, even if somebody told me, and I don't know, put it in my brain, and I was married to this, and I have no doubt anymore, there's no God and this is it. I still give a shit about my son and my job and my relationships. And I mean, I'm not like in this void of, I'm not like floating around in some void of meaninglessness. And then that's the tradition that has made non-belief problematic.
Yeah.
The tradition, and I think this passes over into why Americans are so skeptical about atheists, is that the vision is that atheists are just like, whatever goes, just like shoot. But and even though all the statistics suggest that's not the case, and it's like, no, like, we all have investments. We're raised with families. We love people. We love the things we do. We love our, and those investments, even if we lose faith, even if we're brought up in a faith tradition, sustain. They're not dead. We just don't believe in an afterlife or whatever other bag goes with that. And I think that's such an important part of thinking about the way we live in the world, and an embodied tradition is that, like, I do think that people like Nietzsche in particular, but to some degree Kierkegaard and Camus and Sartre, I think less so de Beauvoir, seem to, and I get it's true that if you're brought up in an entirely religious world and you leave it, it seems radical.
Absolutely, yeah.
But
absolutely.
I think that also, like you're still into the stuff you're into. You're still into the people you're into. It just kind of robs your cosmology. And it also robs you of the necessity of being invested in marrying a woman versus marrying a man or whatever.
But see, this is the problem with many religions. Whichever variant that you're using of it, again, this is my opinion and some of my experience as well. Is so I go full Nietzsche on critique of religion. I totally agree with it, which is it. So he didn't quite say it this way. I've kind of expounded on it, I guess, a little bit, but sort of this idea of values and morals should open you up.
Yeah.
If values and morals are closing you down, then you at least need to reconsider them or throw them in the trash. And in my view, that's exactly what religion in general does, and most specifically Christianity does, is every single thing. Because at the root of the dogma and the doctrine is you have to filter everything you do in human life through an external deity, through Jesus, through the Bible, through the doctrines there. Mm-hmm. You can't almost think on your own. It's always for the glory of God. It's always through Jesus. It's always through, and that's the doctrine. And if you don't, there's this guilt that's associated with, especially in Catholicism. And the problem with that, with Christianity, is that it's always tearing down what it means to be human. It's tearing down. It's to say that to be human is to be sinful. We want to do away with the old man. That's Romans 6, right? We want to do away with the sinful nature, and we need to be redeemed. And the problem with that is that you're starting with humanity as being the thing you have to completely reform, and you have to completely throw it away. And to me, Nietzsche says this, and I totally agree with it, is, in my view, this is a strong statement, but in my view, Christianity is one of the most anti-human ideas and perspectives that we've ever created. It can give you a sense of community all day, but the problem with that, right, is that sense of community and that sense of structure has a lot of other fucking garbage in it with the doctrine. And I have known so many people personally that, because that's what it says, and this isn't just fundamentalist, but I have to always put God and Jesus before even definitely before myself, and therefore the other, and sometimes my own family. Yeah. How does that make sense in living a life worth living?
No, I think this is the value of seeing the world. As Nietzsche says, the world has been turned on its head, and we're seeing this fictional world for what the real world is. And then I think that one of the values of his vision is to, like, what is the real world? I say to my students, like, well, just go to what we call the student union, or is everyone the same? Do you like everybody the same? Like, no. Like, no. This bizarre fiction that we're all equal, and this bizarre fiction that if we don't see everybody as equal, we have to engage in this, like, bizarre exercise to view everybody as equal, which is massively effortful and makes us feel weird and awkward. And I think in particular for individuals, it's not so much about seeing the other person, but it's about seeing ourselves. Like, we evaluate ourselves as not being similar to others. And so I think that this is to me, the more damaging part of the homogenization that's inherent in a kind of Christian world, is that I definitely think there's massive dangers, and I worry about a kind of cheap view of Nietzsche that comes through Ayn Rand and these kind of neoconservatives and this stuff. So
don't get me started on that.
He's a dangerous philosopher in his own right. But nonetheless, if you think about an individual level, I think it's like you feel like, well, I don't feel this way. I don't feel whatever obedient to God. I don't see myself as equal to others. I don't want to desire the gender I'm supposed to desire. And that homogeneity of our culture is, I think, so horrible for individuals and horrible for our flourishing as individuals and as a culture in general. But I do think he also kind of signals to the problem is that when you open that up, you get these kinds of this world in which, and but it's not a problem of Nietzsche. It's a problem of cosmopolitanism. It's a problem of the global world.
Yeah.
We encounter a bunch of other people. They're not like us. We don't know what to do with them.
Yeah, I mean,
it's he, whether or not he existed or not, this is this fundamental problem. And that I think he's right that the psychological weak position that he sees in religion, in particular in Christianity, is to group identify and demonize.
Yeah.
That we see difference and we're like, well, that's horrible because this is what's right. And so I think that he's in essence, a good psychologist of what's going on now. And you see this kind of rise of totalitarianism and this
Mm-hmm.
around the world. In this, we're in this super chaotic. The world's heating up. There's all this. It's not clear what's happening. We're all, and people are like clinging on to these. Of course, from a educated Western position, it seems super bizarre. Like, why would you support Bolsonaro in Brazil? Like, this guy's a numbnut, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
Trump or whatever. But it's that he provides this surety.
Yeah.
The world is fundamentally chaotic and unsure, but the world has always been chaotic and unsure. It's just, I think now it's like revealed to us in a super evident way. And I think even things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
that it's just bringing up stuff that's always been there
Mm-hmm.
and forcing it in our faces. And the solution's not obvious and evident and easy.
Right.
And then we're like, we don't know what to do. And then somebody comes along and says, I will solve all your problems.
I can fix it. Right.
Yeah. And they're like this kind of occupy almost a religious position. And people identify with that. And it's horrible, but
No, but that's, but again,
existential level, I kind of see why they identify with that. Because it's like,
if you can take there's two lenses you can take on that. The first is, it's not a surprise that superhero movies make a shit ton of money all the time, because it's just that narrative over and over and over. And look, I enjoy it as much as the next guy, but there's definitely that narrative, right? The second part about that is that I think from an evolutionary perspective, that totally makes sense. We look for the hierarchy. That's what we look for, social hierarchies. We need to have who's running this, right? Who's doing it? Who's the person that's going to help us out? Who's going to lead us? And we recently rewatched the last 3 Planet of the Apes movies, and everyone wants a Caesar. They want someone to kind of be the boss and kind of run it and lead it, so I don't have to, and I just take the orders. People say they don't, they push back against it, but there's a healthy piece of that, but there is a point where it's like, look, this is the person that doesn't forget us, that speaks for us, that all these things. That's that kind of Hannah Arendt worried about totalitarianism and how that creates that vacuum. Superhuman. That's how it works.
Totalitarianism. I think that's kind of the thing that the madman and the death of God piece. Is there any up or down? The totalitarianism is not a surprising outgrowth. It's a natural outgrowth from human psychology, and the difficulty is resisting it. And I think she was very good about the value of it. And I think Nietzsche fundamentally, my view of Nietzsche, and I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, is that he struggled with it. And her vision of Nietzsche is that he struggled with it because he was too mired in the long tradition of Western philosophy, where answers had to be had.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this sense, there might be kind of a comparison with some religious traditions, where for her, thinking is an open-ended process, the products of which you do not know.
Mm-hmm.
Much like, I don't know, meditation or prayer or something. And that Nietzsche he's just like, there's nothing, like now we're just in this, chaotic thing, so we have to cling to culture. But what she points out is that culture nowadays, and this is then beyond past and future, which I thought was such a good point.
Mm-hmm.
When you present young students with Shakespeare or great films or whatever, they aren't against them, and they really enjoy them, and they find a lot in them, but they aren't guiding. They don't they're like read a Shakespeare play and be like, now I will live my life like Hamlet has taught me to. They don't. And she points it out. She's like, culture doesn't. The bourgeois thought in the 1800s and 1900s that culture would guide us. It does not.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't provide. It's not a substitute for religion.
Yes. And I think
Yeah,
what's happening is that
that's the
people try to
problem
make
is-
it that way.
Right, right.
And that's problematic on many fronts.
Right. So why did people get into the Proud Boys or these other kind of fringe movements? It's that my mind is that if they're not religious, culture's not going to do it for them. They're not going to watch some video games or watch movies or read books.
Mm-hmm.
They need a meaning that exceeds their experience.
Mm-hmm.
But what that is,
yeah. And well, this all leads back to your initial point of how do we have this idea of working on the self?
yeah.
But how do we do it where we work on the self in a way that's open to the various possibilities that we could have to find the authentic self, right? This is very Heidegger.
Yeah.
You know, how do we find that? And how do we allow for that? And what that could be when you're doing that. Eric Fromm wrote about this too. When you're doing that, then you don't have to have this escape from freedom, as he would say, right? Then you're able to say, no, I have it locked within my Dasein, my being, all of these things that can give me meaning and value. And then you permeate outward of how do you have other people that you're interacting with and connecting with in authentic ways to have a healthy network of doing that. And that to me is the answer.
That's a great question. Yeah.
It's it's very tough because it is work. But we can't see it as the same type of work. I guess I'd have to think about that more, but we can't see it as the same type of work that we see like going to work or fixing, changing my oil or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a different type of work.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to see it. I think that's a great note to end it on.
Yes. I was thinking the same.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to say or tell people where they can find you?
I think, as always, I hope in good thinking, we've opened more questions and solved them.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you so much for asking me to do this again. It was such a delight.
Yeah, no, I absolutely adore our conversation. I both of them, and I obviously had so much fun. I really could talk about all this stuff with you for hours, and I hope to do it someday in person soon.
Yeah, let's make that happen. So,
Alrighty.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.